The church was silent until Margaret Holloway's voice cut through it. "In front of everyone, I want this made clear," she said, eyes fixed on Aria Bennett. "You will leave this family today. You were never truly one of us." Murmurs rippled across polished pews. Business partners, relatives, strangers, all watching. Aria didn't defend herself. She didn't speak. Margaret believed she had just erased a widow from her empire. She didn't know. The empire no longer belonged to her. If you believe dignity doesn't need to shout to be powerful, stay with this story until the end. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories about quiet strength and justice matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Aria Bennett had never been the kind of woman people noticed first. In a room filled with polished voices and inherited confidence, she was the one who listened longer than she spoke. She observed patterns others overlooked. She remembered details no one thought mattered until they did. At Holloway Holdings, she had always occupied a position that made her nearly invisible. Her title, Senior Compliance Analyst, sounded respectable enough, but it placed her far from the center of power. She reviewed documents others signed. She flagged inconsistencies that were often dismissed. She sat in meetings where decisions were already made before she entered the room. And yet, she understood more about the company than most of those seated at the top. Because Aria paid attention. The headquarters of Holloway Holdings stood in Midtown Manhattan, a glass tower that reflected both ambition and control. Inside, everything moved with quiet precision. Assistants spoke in measured tones. Executives avoided unnecessary eye contact. Every floor had its own hierarchy, its own invisible boundaries. At the very top of that structure stood Margaret Holloway. Margaret did not need to raise her voice to command attention. Her presence alone recalibrated a room. She dressed in restrained elegance, never loud, never careless. Her words were deliberate, each one placed with intention. She had inherited the company from her late husband, but it was widely understood that she had expanded it beyond what anyone else could have managed. Under her leadership, Holloway Holdings had grown into a billion-dollar entity spanning real estate infrastructure and private equity. To Margaret, the company was not just a business. It was legacy. And legacy required control. Her son, Owen Holloway, was expected to inherit that control. But Owen had never mirrored his mother's approach. Where Margaret was decisive, Owen was contemplative. Where she prioritized dominance, he prioritized stability. He listened longer than most executives would tolerate, and he questioned decisions others accepted without hesitation. This difference had created a quiet tension between them, one that was never openly acknowledged, but always present. Aria had noticed it long before anyone else did. She first met Owen during an internal audit review 2 years before their marriage. The meeting had been routine on paper. A mid-level compliance briefing, several department heads. A stack of documents flagged for minor inconsistencies. Aria had expected to present her findings, receive polite acknowledgement, and leave. Instead, Owen had stayed after the meeting ended. "You flagged 3 discrepancies no one else mentioned," he said, flipping through her report. "They weren't major," Aria replied. "They weren't obvious," Owen corrected gently. "That's different." It was the first time someone in leadership had taken her work seriously, not as a formality, but as something of value. That conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. But it changed everything that followed. Over the next few months, Owen began requesting her presence in more reviews. Not publicly, never in a way that drew attention, but consistently enough that others began to notice. Margaret noticed too. She didn't say anything at first, but her silence was never neutral. By the time Aria and Owen's relationship became known, the response within the Holloway family was restrained and cold. There was no scandal, no confrontation, no dramatic objections, just a subtle, unmistakable shift. Invitations that didn't arrive, conversations that ended when Aria approached, glances that lasted a fraction too long. Margaret had received the news with a composed expression. "If this is your decision," she had told Owen, "then I trust you've considered the implications." It wasn't approval. It wasn't disapproval. It was something more controlled than either. The wedding itself had been small, deliberately so, held at a private venue in upstate New York, attended by a limited circle of associates and distant relatives. No press, no public announcement beyond a formal statement issued days later. To outsiders, it appeared tasteful. To those who understood the family, it was exclusion. Aria had never expected acceptance. But she had not anticipated the precision with which she would be kept at a distance. Within the company, nothing about her role changed. She was not promoted. She was not included in executive decisions. She remained exactly where she had been before, except now every movement she made was quietly observed. Lucas Holloway made sure of that. Owen's younger brother had always been more aligned with Margaret's way of thinking. Ambitious, direct, uninterested in subtlety unless it served a purpose. Where Owen saw systems, Lucas saw leverage. "Funny how things work," Lucas had said once, leaning casually against the doorway of a conference room as Aria organized her files. "You spend years climbing, and then suddenly, you skip the ladder." Aria didn't respond. She closed her folder, aligned the edges carefully, and walked past him without acknowledgement. Lucas watched her go, a faint smile forming. "She's either very smart," he later told Margaret, "or very patient." Margaret's response had been simple. "Either way," she said, "she is not in control." At home, things were different. Not warm, but quieter. Owen didn't bring the tension of the company into their private space. He spoke less about work, more about ideas, systems, structures, the way decisions echoed beyond their immediate impact. Aria listened. Not because she needed to, but because she understood that what Owen didn't say often mattered more than what he did. "You don't ask many questions," he told her once. "I do," Aria replied, "just not out loud." Owen had smiled at that. It was one of the few moments where something unguarded passed between them. But even in those moments, there were boundaries. Unspoken, deliberate. There were parts of his work he didn't explain. Documents he reviewed alone. Meetings he attended without mention. At the time, Aria didn't press. Not because she wasn't curious, but because she trusted him. And trust to her did not require full visibility. It required consistency. From the outside, their marriage appeared distant. Two individuals moving in parallel rather than together. But beneath that surface, there was alignment, quiet, steady, and intentional. Owen never defended Aria publicly. But decisions that affected her were always adjusted, subtly. A report that might have been dismissed was reviewed more carefully. A proposal that excluded her department was reconsidered. A meeting she wasn't invited to was postponed until she could attend. No announcements, no acknowledgments, just outcomes. Margaret noticed those too. She said nothing. But she began to watch more closely, because in her world, influence was never accidental. And Aria Bennett, quiet, observant, consistently underestimated, was beginning to influence outcomes without ever appearing to try. That, to Margaret, was not a flaw. It was a risk. And risks, when left unmanaged, had a way of reshaping everything. Aria didn't see herself that way. She still arrived early, still reviewed documents line by line, still took notes no one asked for. But there were moments almost imperceptible when she began to sense the shift. Not in how people spoke to her, but in how they hesitated, as if something about her presence required recalculation. She didn't confront it. She didn't question it. She simply observed, and somewhere above her, beyond the floors she worked on, beyond the meetings she attended, decisions were being made. Structures were being adjusted. Ownership was being reconsidered. Aria didn't know it yet, but she was already at the center of something far larger than her position suggested. And the people who believed they controlled everything were already too late to change it. Long before Aria Bennett's name appeared anywhere near Holloway Holdings, her life had followed a structure built on necessity, not privilege. She grew up in a modest neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, in a house where nothing was wasted. Not time, not money, not words. Her father had been an electrician who believed in precision. Her mother worked part-time at a public library, where silence was not just expected, but respected. Aria learned early that attention was a form of discipline. You watched, you listened, you understood before you spoke. There were no shortcuts in her upbringing, no introductions that opened doors, no safety nets disguised as opportunity. Everything she earned came through consistency, quiet, steady, unremarkable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. She chose law not because it was prestigious, but because it made sense. Rules, when written properly, created order. And order, when enforced correctly, protected people who had no power of their own. At least, that was the theory. By the time she graduated and entered the workforce, Aria understood that theory and reality rarely aligned. How laws could be interpreted, systems could be bent. Authority often favored those who already had it. So she adjusted. She stopped expecting fairness and started focusing on accuracy. Her early roles were exactly what one would expect. Document review, regulatory compliance, internal audits. Work that required patience more than recognition. The kind of work that disappeared the moment it was done correctly. She didn't mind, because accuracy, unlike attention, didn't depend on who was watching. Her entry into Holloway Holdings came through a lateral move, nothing remarkable on paper. A mid-level compliance position in a large corporation where individual contributions were easily absorbed into the system. To most people, it was just another job. To Aria, it was access, not to power, but to structure. Holloway Holdings was not chaotic. It was meticulously organized. Layers of approval, chains of command, financial pathways that branched and reconnected in ways that only made sense if you followed them carefully. And Aria did. She noticed how certain decisions bypassed standard review channels, how specific departments operated with unusual autonomy, how certain names appeared repeatedly, not in obvious ways, but in patterns that suggested influence rather than authority. She never pointed these things out directly, not at first. Instead, she documented, quietly, consistently. The first time Owen Holloway truly noticed her was not because of what she said, but because of what she refused to ignore. It was during a quarterly compliance review involving a series of minor discrepancies in a subsidiary's reporting. On the surface, the issues were insignificant. Small timing differences, slight inconsistencies in classification, the kind of irregularities that could be explained, and often were. Most analysts would have flagged them and moved on. Aria didn't. She traced them, not just individually, but collectively. And what she found wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate. The discrepancies, when aligned, revealed a pattern of timing adjustments that shifted financial visibility, not illegally, but strategically. It wasn't fraud. It was positioning. And that distinction mattered. When she presented her findings, she didn't accuse. She didn't speculate. She simply laid out the structure. This pattern, she said, pointing to the timeline she had reconstructed, suggests coordination across departments that are not formally connected. There was a brief silence in the room, not because her conclusion was controversial, but because it was inconvenient. Owen had been sitting at the far end of the table, reviewing documents without interruption. He looked up, not immediately, but deliberately. "Walk me through that again," he said. Aria did. The second explanation was no different from the first. Same tone, same clarity, same absence of emotion. But this time Owen didn't look at the documents. He looked at her. Not assessing, not challenging, understanding. After the meeting, he approached her not as an executive addressing an employee, but as someone evaluating a variable he hadn't accounted for. "You didn't escalate this," he said. "It didn't meet escalation criteria," Aria replied. "But it could have," Owen noted. "Yes. Why didn't it?" Aria paused, not out of uncertainty, but precision. "Because escalation would have focused on accountability," she said. And the issue isn't who did it. It's how the system allows it. Owen held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded. That was the moment. Not when something began, but when something was recognized. From then on, their interactions remained limited, but intentional. Owen didn't pull her into visible roles. He didn't elevate her position in ways that would attract attention. Instead, he created proximity, subtle, controlled. She was included in reviews that required careful interpretation, asked for input on matters framed as technical but clearly strategic, never publicly credited, but never ignored. Aria understood what that meant. Visibility in a structure like Holloway Holdings was not always an advantage. Sometimes it was exposure, and exposure without protection was liability. So she remained exactly where she appeared to be. Unthreatening, quiet, reliable. Lucas Holloway, however, was not as patient as his brother. He noticed patterns too, but he interpreted them differently. Where Owen saw value, Lucas saw deviation. Compliance isn't strategy, Lucas remarked during one internal discussion, his tone casual but pointed. We don't need analysts influencing operational decisions. Aria didn't respond. She wasn't supposed to. But Owen did. Understanding structure is part of strategy, he said simply. Lucas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Only if you're the one making decisions. Margaret, seated at the head of the table, said nothing. But her silence carried weight. She didn't question Owen. She didn't acknowledge Aria. But she adjusted. Meetings became more selective, information more compartmentalized, access more controlled. Not abruptly, but gradually. Aria noticed. Of course she did. But she didn't react. Because reaction would have confirmed relevance. And relevance in that environment attracted scrutiny. Instead, she adapted. She relied less on direct access and more on pattern recognition. Less on participation and more on observation. Because systems, no matter how controlled, always left traces. And Aria had always been good at following them. Outside the office, her relationship with Owen remained measured. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic declarations, but there was consistency. He never dismissed her observations, never simplified her perspective, never treated her as an extension of his position. That mattered more than anything he could have said. One evening, months before his diagnosis, they sat in silence in their apartment overlooking the city. Owen was reviewing documents. Aria was reading. Neither spoke for a long time. Then, without looking up, Owen said, "If something were structured differently, would you recognize it?" Aria closed her book slowly. "Structured differently, how in a way that isn't immediately visible," he said. She considered the question, not the words, but the intent behind them. "Yes," she answered, eventually. Owen nodded, as if that was enough. At the time, Aria didn't ask why he had asked. She didn't need to, because questions like systems revealed themselves in time. And Owen Holloway had already begun building something that would outlast him, something precise, something intentional, something hidden in plain sight. Aria didn't know the full extent of it yet. But she would. And when she did, everything Margaret Holloway believed she controlled would begin to shift quietly, irreversibly, and far beyond her reach. The first sign that something was wrong with Owen Holloway did not come from a doctor. It came from absence. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that rearranges routine in ways only a careful observer would notice. Meetings he once attended without fail were rescheduled. Calls were shortened. Travel plans, especially those requiring long flights, were quietly canceled or reassigned. His calendar, once tightly structured, began to show small pockets of unexplained space. No one commented on it. At Holloway Holdings, absence was rarely questioned, especially when it belonged to someone at the top. But Aria noticed. She didn't ask him directly at first. Not because she wasn't concerned, but because she understood something about Owen that others did not. He revealed information in layers. And forcing the first layer open would only delay the rest. So she watched. She observed the way he paused slightly longer before responding to questions, the way he pressed his fingers against the edge of the table as if grounding himself, the way he began delegating decisions he would normally handle personally. None of it was dramatic, but it was consistent. And consistency to Aria was never accidental, Margaret noticed too. But unlike Aria, she did not wait. The moment she sensed a shift, she moved to contain it. Schedules were tightened, but selectively. Owen's public appearances were maintained carefully curated to project continuity. Press releases continued as usual. Investor communications remained confident, unchanged in tone. Inside the company, however, adjustments were made. Lucas Holloway began appearing in meetings he had previously been excluded from. Senior executives were redirected to report through alternate channels. Decisions that once required Owen's approval were quietly rerouted temporarily, of course. Everything was framed as precaution. Nothing was framed as concern. Aria saw the pattern forming before anyone acknowledged its shape. One evening, as the city lights flickered against the glass walls of their apartment, Owen finally spoke. "I need you to listen carefully," he said. There was no preamble, no attempt to soften what followed. Aria set aside the documents she had been reviewing. "I am," she replied. Owen didn't sit. He remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, not for support, but for balance. "I've been diagnosed," he said. He didn't name the illness immediately. He didn't need to. The structure of the sentence, the precision, the lack of qualification was enough. Aria didn't interrupt, didn't react. She simply waited. "It's aggressive," he continued, "and it's already progressed beyond what can be managed long-term." There it was, clear, unambiguous. Aria felt the weight of the information settle not as panic, but as recalibration. "How long?" she asked. Owen held her gaze. "Less than a year," he said. The room remained quiet. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware, uninterrupted. Inside, something irreversible had already begun. Aria nodded once, not in acceptance, but in understanding. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Owen exhaled slowly. "Consistency," he said, "and patience." He stepped away from the chair, moving toward the window. "There are things I've already started putting in place," he continued. "Structures that won't make sense immediately. Decisions that will look disconnected." Aria listened. "You don't need to understand them right now," he added. "You just need to trust that they're deliberate." Trust. It wasn't a request, it was a requirement. Aria didn't ask for details, not because she didn't want them, but because she recognized the boundary he was maintaining. And boundaries, when respected, often revealed more than questions ever could. "I understand," she said. Owen nodded. That was all. No reassurances, no promises, just alignment. From that point forward, everything changed quietly. Owen's presence at the office became more selective. He attended only the meetings that required his direct involvement. Delegated the rest with increasing precision. His decisions, once broad in scope, became highly targeted, focused on specific areas of the company that to most observers didn't seem immediately connected. But they were. Aria began to see the pattern. Not fully, but enough to recognize intention. Certain subsidiaries were restructured, ownership chains adjusted, legal entities, some dormant, some newly created, began appearing in documentation. At first glance, it looked like routine corporate optimization. But Aria knew better, because the changes were too coordinated, too precise. Each adjustment connected to another, not visibly but structurally, like pieces of a system being rearranged beneath the surface. She didn't interfere, didn't ask for clarification. She continued her work as she always had, reviewing, documenting, observing. But now she paid closer attention to anything that bore Owen's authorization. Because those were the decisions that mattered. Margaret, meanwhile, tightened her control. She did not acknowledge Owen's illness publicly. Within the family, it was treated as a temporary setback, something to be managed, not discussed. But her actions suggested otherwise. She expanded her oversight, increased her presence in executive operations, reinforced her influence over key departments. Lucas became more visible, more involved, more assertive. "We need continuity," Margaret stated during one internal strategy meeting. "And continuity requires clarity and leadership." The implication was clear, even if it was never spoken directly. Aria sat at the far end of the room, taking notes. Not because she was asked to, but because she always did. Lucas glanced at her once briefly, as if trying to determine whether she understood the shift taking place. She gave him nothing. No reaction, no acknowledgement, just silence. Because silence, when used correctly, revealed more than words ever could. In the weeks that followed, Owen's private meetings increased. Not with executives, not with family, but with one specific individual, Jonathan Pierce, a senior attorney who had worked with Holloway Holdings for decades, but rarely appeared in day-to-day operations. Jonathan wasn't part of the visible structure. He operated outside it, and that made him significant. Aria noticed the frequency of those meetings not through direct observation, but through the subtle traces they left behind. Calendar adjustments, document requests, authorization logs, nothing explicit, but enough. One afternoon, as Aria finalized a compliance report, she saw Jonathan Pierce exit Owen's office. Their conversation had clearly been long, deliberate. Jonathan carried no visible documents, which meant everything discussed had already been prepared or memorized. He passed by Aria without acknowledgement. But just before reaching the elevator, he paused very briefly and looked back. Not at the office, at her. It wasn't a gesture most people would have noticed. But Aria did, and she understood what it meant. She was being observed, not as an employee, but as a variable. Later that evening, Owen returned home later than usual. He looked tired, but not uncertain. There was a difference. "Things are moving faster now," he said. Aria nodded. "I've noticed." He studied her for a moment. "You haven't asked any questions." "You said I didn't need to," she replied. Owen allowed himself a faint smile. "That doesn't mean you don't have them." "I do," Aria said, "but I'll wait." "For what?" "For the point where the answers matter." Owen's expression shifted subtly but unmistakably. Approval, not spoken, but present. "That point is coming," he said. Aria believed him, because everything about Owen, his decisions, his timing, his restraint, suggested that nothing he did was without purpose. And whatever he was building, it wasn't for himself. It was for what came after. Aria didn't know the full structure yet, but she could feel it taking shape, layer by layer, decision by decision, hidden beneath the surface of a company that believed it was still operating under the same control. Margaret believed she was reinforcing her authority. Lucas believed he was moving closer to power. The board believed continuity was being preserved. They were all watching the visible structure. None of them were looking beneath it. But Aria was. And though she didn't yet see the full design, she understood enough to know this. By the time anyone realized what Owen had done, it would already be irreversible. Time, once measured in quarters and fiscal projections, began to compress into something quieter, more deliberate. For Owen Holloway, the days no longer revolved around expansion. They revolved around completion. Not of deals, not of strategies, but of structure. The kind of structure that would remain intact even after the person who designed it was no longer there to explain it. Aria noticed the shift not in what he said, but in what he chose to finish. Projects that had been deferred for months were suddenly prioritized. Contracts that could have waited were reviewed personally. Legal documents, dense, technical, often overlooked by those outside compliance, were now at the center of his attention. And always somewhere within that process, Jonathan Pierce was involved. The meetings between them became more frequent, but never public. They took place behind closed doors at irregular hours with no assistants present and no summaries distributed afterward. Whatever was being finalized, it wasn't meant for immediate visibility. One evening, as late autumn settled over the city, Owen asked Aria to join him in his study. It wasn't a room she entered often. Not because she wasn't welcome, but because it was a space he used with intention. Every document inside it had a purpose. Every file was placed where it needed to be. There was no excess, only structure. Owen stood near the desk when she entered, a stack of documents arranged neatly in front of him. "Close the door," he said. Aria did. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. There was a stillness in the room that suggested finality, not urgency, but precision. Owen gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit," she sat. He didn't immediately begin speaking. Instead, he picked up the first document and placed it in front of her. "These require your signature," he said. Aria looked down. The document was legal complex, layered, structured in language that was both specific and intentionally dense. She began reading, line by line, carefully. Owen didn't interrupt. He didn't explain. He waited. The first document referenced a trust. Not unusual, but the structure was. The trust was not tied directly to Holloway Holdings. Instead, it referenced an independent entity, one that existed outside the visible corporate hierarchy. Aria recognized the name. Bennett Strategic Holdings, LLC. Her name. Not as an employee, not as a spouse, but as a principal. She didn't look up. She kept reading. The second document outlined an equity transfer. Not immediate, conditional, activated under specific circumstances that were defined with legal precision, but not explicitly described in plain terms. The third document detailed authorization rights, control mechanisms, decision thresholds, all structured in a way that dispersed visibility while consolidating authority. It was not a simple transfer of ownership. It was a system, and it had been designed to operate without drawing attention. Aria finished reading the first set of documents and placed them back on the table. Why, she asked. It was the first question she had asked him since his diagnosis. Owen didn't answer immediately. Because the answer wasn't simple. Because visibility is the first thing they control, he said finally, and anything visible can be taken. Aria understood. Margaret controlled visibility. She controlled narrative. She controlled perception. But this... Aria glanced at the documents. "This removes it entirely." "Yes." "And gives it to me." Owen met her gaze. "Yes." There was no hesitation, no ambiguity. Aria leaned back slightly, absorbing the weight of what that meant. "This isn't protection," she said. "It is," Owen replied, "just not for me." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, but heavy. "You're not telling me everything," Aria said. Owen allowed a small exhale, something close to acknowledgement. "No," he said. "I'm not." Aria didn't press. She didn't need the full explanation, because she could already see the outline. If the visible structure of Holloway Holdings remained unchanged, Margaret would continue to operate as if nothing had shifted. If the true ownership existed elsewhere quietly, legally, irrevocably, then control would not belong to the person who appeared to hold it. It would belong to the person who didn't. And that person would be her. "You're making me invisible," Aria said. Owen shook his head slightly. "No," he corrected. "I'm making you unremovable." The distinction mattered. Aria looked back at the documents. The language was precise. The execution would be silent. And once completed, it could not be undone without her consent. "You said I should trust the process," she said. "Yes. This is the process." "Yes." Another pause. Then Aria reached for the pen. She didn't rush. She signed each document with the same care she applied to everything else, deliberate, steady, without hesitation. When she finished, she placed the pen down exactly where she had found it. Owen gathered the documents and aligned them carefully. "They'll be filed in stages," he said. "Not all at once. So no one notices," Aria replied. "So no one can exit," Owen corrected. Again, the distinction mattered. Aria stood. "So what happens now?" she asked. Owen looked at her, not as a husband, not as an executive, but as someone who had just handed over something that could not be taken back. Now he said, "You continue exactly as you've been." Aria almost smiled. "Unnoticed," she said. "Underestimated," Owen replied. They understood each other. That was enough. In the weeks that followed, nothing appeared to change. Aria returned to work, reviewed documents, attended meetings she was invited to, and nothing more. Margaret continued to consolidate her authority. Lucas became more aggressive in his involvement. The board remained confident in the company's direction. From the outside, Holloway Holdings was stable, controlled, unchallenged. But beneath that surface, filings were being processed. Entities were being activated. Ownership was being restructured, not in ways that triggered alarms, but in ways that redefined the foundation without altering the appearance. Jonathan Pierce handled everything. Quietly, precisely. Each document moved through the system exactly as it was designed to. No delays, no errors, no attention. Aria didn't follow up, didn't check status updates, didn't ask for confirmation, because she understood something most people didn't. If a system is built correctly, it doesn't require supervision. It requires patience. Owen's condition, meanwhile, continued to decline. Gradually, then all at once, he became thinner, more reserved, but never uncertain. Even in his weakest moments, there was clarity in his decisions. No second-guessing, no reversal. Everything moved forward, as planned. One night, as winter began to settle over the city, Aria found him sitting by the window, looking out over the skyline. The lights reflected in the glass, creating the illusion of something larger than what was actually there. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Owen didn't turn. "No," he said. "Not even a little." He shook his head. "Regret comes from uncertainty," he replied. "I'm not uncertain." Aria stood beside him. She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. He wasn't uncertain about the structure, or the outcome, or her. That was the only reason any of it would work. Because trust, once embedded into a system like that, became part of its foundation. And foundations were the hardest things to dismantle. Aria looked out at the city. Everything appeared the same, unchanged. But she knew better, because somewhere beneath the surface of contracts, filings, and silent decisions, everything had already shifted. Margaret still believed she controlled the company. Lucas still believed he was next in line. The board still believed in continuity. They were all looking at the visible structure. None of them could see what had already been transferred. Not until it mattered. Not until it was too late. Aria didn't feel powerful. She didn't feel victorious. She felt responsible. And that responsibility had been given to her without explanation, without instruction, and without the option to refuse. But she had accepted it anyway. Not because she wanted control, but because Owen had trusted her with it. And that more than anything written in those documents was the one thing she would not allow to be broken. Owen Holloway's death was announced on a Monday morning. The statement was brief, controlled, carefully written to preserve dignity while revealing as little as possible. It is with profound sadness that we announce the passing of Owen Holloway. No mention of illness, no timeline, no vulnerability, just legacy. By noon, the news had spread across financial networks, industry circles, and private channels where influence traveled faster than information. By evening, the narrative had already been shaped. A tragic loss, a promising leader gone too soon, a transition that would require strength. Margaret Holloway ensured that strength had a face. Her face. The funeral was scheduled for Thursday, private but not quiet. Held at St. Bartholomew's Church in Manhattan, a place chosen not for intimacy, but for symbolism. It was where presence could be measured, where absence could be noticed. Executives attended, board members, long-standing partners, individuals whose names rarely appeared publicly, but whose decisions shaped markets. They came not just to mourn, they came to observe. Aria arrived early, not out of obligation, but out of habit. She wore black unadorned, no jewelry beyond her wedding ring. Her hair pulled back, her posture composed. She did not seek acknowledgement, and none was offered. People recognized her, of course, but recognition did not translate to inclusion. Conversations paused briefly as she passed, then resumed in lower tones. Measured, careful. As if her presence required adjustment, Margaret stood near the front of the church, receiving condolences with controlled grace. Her expression remained unchanged grief contained within the boundaries she allowed it. Lucas stood beside her, not mourning, positioning. He greeted executives with confidence that bordered on impatience, his posture already aligned with someone preparing to step forward. Neither of them approached Aria, and Aria did not approach them, because roles once defined rarely shifted in public spaces. The service began precisely on time. The organ filled the space with a low, steady resonance. Words were spoken, carefully chosen, professionally delivered. Owen was described as thoughtful, disciplined, forward-thinking. All true, none complete. Aria listened without reacting. She did not cry, not because she felt nothing, but because what she felt had no place in a room designed for controlled expression. She stood when others stood, sat when others sat, moved when the service required it, and remained still when it didn't. To anyone watching, she was composed, appropriate, forgettable, until the end, when the final words were spoken and the attendees began to rise. Margaret turned, not toward the casket, toward Aria. The movement was deliberate, calculated, and impossible to ignore. "In front of everyone, I want this made clear," Margaret said. Her voice did not need to be raised. It carried, naturally, effortlessly. The room stilled. Conversations halted. Attention shifted. "You will leave this family today," Margaret continued, her gaze unwavering. "You were never truly one of us." The words landed without distortion. No one interrupted. No one intervened. Because this was not an outburst. It was a declaration. Lucas remained silent, but his expression confirmed alignment. This was expected, planned. Aria stood where she was. She did not look away, did not respond. Margaret took a step closer. "You have no role here," she said. "No claim, no place in what comes next." There it was. Not grief, not anger, control. Defined in public so it could not be questioned in private. Aria understood the purpose. This was not about removing her. It was about establishing narrative. If she left quietly now, if she accepted the dismissal without resistance, then her absence would be interpreted as confirmation. She had never belonged. She had never mattered. And whatever followed would proceed without complication. Aria said nothing, because anything she said would have been used against her. So she did the only thing that could not be reframed. She remained still, for a moment longer than expected. Then she nodded. Once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Margaret stepped back, satisfied. The message had been delivered. The audience had received it, and no one had challenged it. That was all she needed. The room began to move again, slowly at first, then with increasing normalcy. Conversations resumed, condolences continued, as if nothing unusual had happened. But everyone had seen it, and they would remember, because public humiliation, when executed with a precision, had a way of becoming permanent. Aria turned, not abruptly, not dramatically. She walked down the aisle with the same measured pace she had entered with, no hesitation, no visible reaction, just movement. At the exit, a few individuals glanced at her, but none spoke, because association in moments like this carried risk. Outside, the air was colder, sharper, unfiltered. Aria paused on the steps of the church, not to reflect, not to grieve, but to adjust, because something had just been finalized. Not legally, not structurally, but socially. She had been removed, publicly, completely. And now everything that followed would operate under that assumption. A black car waited at the curb, not for her, for Margaret, for Lucas, for the continuation of control. Aria walked past it. She did not look back, because there was nothing behind her that required confirmation. The house on the Upper East Side, the one she had lived in with Owen, was no longer hers to enter. Not in practice, not according to Margaret. And Margaret controlled access, security, staff, every visible point of entry. By the time Aria arrived, her access had already been revoked. The doorman who had once greeted her by name avoided eye contact. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Aria nodded. "I understand." No argument, no demand, because the decision had already been made, and she had no intention of contesting it there. She turned away, again, without resistance, without acknowledgement, because the place she had lived was never the place she had belonged. That distinction mattered now. Her belongings, what little she had kept there, had been packed, not by her, carefully, efficiently, delivered to a temporary holding service. Margaret had ensured the process was clean, undisputable, final. Aria collected a single suitcase that evening, nothing more. No confrontation, no negotiation, just transfer. By nightfall, she stood in a small apartment she had arranged earlier that day. One bedroom, minimal furniture, functional, temporary, the kind of space that did not ask questions. She placed the suitcase near the wall, did not unpack it. Instead, she sat at the small table by the window. The city looked different from here, closer, less controlled, more real. For the first time since the funeral, she allowed herself to close her eyes. Not to escape, but to process. Everything had unfolded exactly as expected. Not by Margaret, not by Lucas, but by Owen. This was part of it. The removal, the isolation, the assumption that she had been left with nothing, because only under those conditions would what came next be seen clearly. Aria opened her eyes, reached into her bag, and took out a folder, not large, not labeled, but significant. Inside were copies, not originals. Those were already filed, already processed, already beyond reach. These were for her, to review, to understand, to prepare. She opened the folder slowly, page by page, line by line, the same way she had always done. Outside, the city continued as it always had. Inside, Aria Bennett began to read, not as an employee, not as a widow, but as something no one else had yet recognized. The person who no longer needed permission to belong. The apartment Aria Bennett had chosen was not accidental, though, to anyone else. It would have appeared that way. It was located on the 4th floor of an older building in Brooklyn, far removed from the polished symmetry of Manhattan's financial district, where glass towers reflected power in clean, uninterrupted lines. Here, the walls carried faint imperfections, the floors creaked in subtle protest with each step, and the windows framed a city that felt closer, less filtered, more honest. She had secured the lease within hours of leaving the church. Not in panic, and not as an act of retreat, but as a continuation of something she had already anticipated. Because long before Margaret Holloway had spoken those words in public, long before the formal removal had taken place, Aria had understood that access, physical, social, and institutional, would be revoked the moment it no longer served the narrative of control. So she had prepared quietly and without announcement. Now seated at a small wooden table by the window, she allowed the silence of the apartment to settle around her. It was not the silence of absence, but the kind that allowed thought to move without interruption. The suitcase remained closed near the wall, untouched, because what mattered was not what she had brought with her, but what had already been transferred beyond visibility. The folder in front of her was thin, but its contents were not. She opened it again, even though she had already reviewed every page twice that evening, and began to read from the beginning, not because she had missed anything, but because repetition clarified structure. Each document was a fragment of a larger design, and only by revisiting them in sequence could she begin to see how they connected. The first set of documents outlined the formation of Bennett Strategic Holdings, LLC. At the time she had signed them, the entity had seemed abstract, a legal structure without immediate function. Now, with context shifting around her, its purpose became more defined. It was not an operational company, nor was it intended to be visible within the traditional hierarchy of Holloway Holdings. Instead, it functioned as a holding structure, one designed to receive, manage, and ultimately control assets without drawing attention to itself. The second set detailed the trust arrangement. The language was precise, intentionally layered, constructed in a way that required both legal literacy and patience to fully interpret. The trust was irrevocable, under specific conditions, with Aria designated as the sole beneficiary and controlling party. However, the activation of that control was not tied to a single event, but rather to a sequence of triggers, each one not subtle enough to pass unnoticed unless examined collectively. Aria paused there, her eyes tracing the phrasing again. This was where Owen's thinking revealed itself most clearly. He had not designed a single transfer of power. He had designed a system that redistributed power incrementally in a way that could not be easily contested because no single step appeared significant on its own. The final documents in the folder referenced equity positions, not in Holloway Holdings directly, but in entities that existed one layer removed from it. Subsidiaries, partnerships, and financial vehicles that, when viewed independently, seemed peripheral. However, when mapped together, they formed a controlling interest that did not rely on visibility to function. Aria leaned back slightly, allowing the connections to settle. She did not feel overwhelmed. She did not feel empowered. What she felt was responsibility, precise, structured, and unavoidable. Because what Owen had built did not require her to act immediately. It required her to understand. And understanding in this case could not be rushed. She closed the folder gently and reached for her laptop, placing it on the table with the same measured care she applied to everything else. The screen illuminated the dim room, casting a soft reflection against the window behind it. Her access credentials had not been revoked. Not yet. Margaret had moved quickly to remove her from physical spaces, but digital systems, especially those structured across multiple entities, required more time to adjust. And time, even in small increments, was something Aria knew how to use. She logged into the internal compliance portal first. Nothing appeared out of place. Her role remained unchanged, her permissions intact. From there, she navigated through layers of data that most employees never accessed directly: financial summaries, audit trails, intercompany transfers. The information was dense but familiar. She did not search for confirmation of ownership. She already knew what the documents had established. Instead, she looked for movement, patterns, shifts that had occurred in the weeks leading up to Owen's death. And she found them, not immediately and not in a single location, but in fragments that required alignment. A transfer of funds between two subsidiaries that had no direct operational relationship. An adjustment in reporting timelines that altered when certain financial positions became visible. A reclassification of assets that moved them from one category to another without changing their underlying value. Each change on its own could be explained. Together they formed a pattern. And that pattern pointed in one direction, toward the structure Owen had built. Aria documented everything, not because she intended to act on it immediately, but because documentation preserved clarity. She created a separate file organized by date and entity, noting each irregularity and its corresponding explanation. She did not speculate. She did not interpret beyond what could be supported. Because speculation in systems like this introduced risk. And risk, when unnecessary, weakened structure. Hours passed without interruption. The city outside shifted from evening to night, then to something quieter, more still. The sounds of traffic softened, replaced by the distant hum of movement that never fully stopped. Inside the apartment, Aria remained focused. At some point she paused, not from fatigue, but from recognition. There was an email, unopened, time-stamped 3 days before Owen's death. The sender was not unfamiliar, Owen Holloway. She had seen it earlier, not avoided it, but delayed it, because timing mattered. And now, with the structure of everything else beginning to take shape, she understood that this was the moment to read it. She opened the message slowly. There was no subject line, no formal greeting, just a single paragraph. If you're reading this, it means the system is already in place. You don't need to move quickly. You don't need to prove anything. Let them believe what they want. What matters is what holds, not what shows. Trust the structure. It will lead you to the point where action becomes necessary. Until then, remain exactly as you are. Aria read it twice, then a third time, not because it was complex, but because it was precise. Owen had not given her instructions. He had given her boundaries, and within those boundaries, she had complete control. She closed the email and leaned back, her gaze drifting toward the window. Margaret believed she had removed her. Lucas believed he was stepping into position. The board believed continuity had been preserved. They were all operating within the visible structure. And for now, Aria would allow that. Because visibility was not where control existed. Control existed in what had already been transferred, documented, and secured beyond immediate perception. She closed her laptop. Not because she was finished, but because she had reached the point Owen had described. Understanding. Action would come later, when it was necessary, when it could not be avoided. For now, she would remain exactly as she had always been. Quiet, observant, present, but no longer overlooked. Because what Margaret had removed in public had already been replaced in private with something far more difficult to take away. And the moment that difference became visible would not belong to those who believed they controlled it. The following morning arrived without ceremony, as if the world had decided not to acknowledge that anything had shifted at all. The city resumed its rhythm with the same quiet insistence, and within that rhythm, Holloway Holdings continued to operate as though its foundation remained untouched. Aria Bennett did not rush to disrupt that illusion. Instead, she followed routine. She woke early, prepared coffee without distraction, and reviewed her notes from the previous night with the same methodical attention she had applied to every detail since Owen's death. There was no urgency in her movements, only continuity. Because what she was building now was not reaction, but clarity, and clarity required discipline. By mid-morning, she had made a decision, not to act, but to confirm. Jonathan Pierce's office was located in a quieter part of Manhattan, removed from the high-traffic corporate avenues that surrounded Holloway Holdings. The building itself did not advertise prominence, but its discretion was intentional. Clients who entered did not do so for visibility. Aria arrived precisely on time. She wore the same neutral tones she had always preferred, nothing that invited attention, nothing that suggested change. To anyone observing, she remained exactly what she had always been: composed, unremarkable, easy to overlook. The receptionist recognized her immediately, though she did not display it openly. "Miss Bennett," she said in a measured tone, "Mr. Pierce is expecting you." Of course he was. Aria nodded and followed the quiet hallway toward his office, noting the absence of unnecessary movement. The controlled stillness that suggested confidentiality was not a feature here. It was a requirement. Jonathan Pierce stood as she entered. He was older than most attorneys who still maintained active practice, but there was nothing diminished about him. His posture remained straight, his expression composed, his eyes attentive in a way that suggested he missed very little. "Miss Bennett," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "Please." Aria sat. She did not begin with explanation. Neither did he. Because both of them understood that the purpose of this meeting did not require introduction. Jonathan folded his hands lightly on the desk. "I assume you've reviewed the documents," he said. "I have," Aria replied. "And you understand their structure. I understand enough to know that I don't yet understand everything." A faint shift in Jonathan's expression, approval, though not explicitly stated. "That's correct," he said. "The structure was designed that way." Aria held his gaze. "Then I'd like to understand what matters now," she said. Jonathan leaned back slightly, considering his words before speaking. "What matters now," he began, "is that nothing changes." The answer might have sounded contradictory to anyone else. To Aria, it aligned perfectly. Margaret believes she has assumed full control. Jonathan continued. "Lucas is positioning himself accordingly. The board is operating under the assumption that the existing hierarchy remains intact." "And they're wrong," Aria said. Jonathan did not immediately confirm. "They are incomplete in their understanding," he replied. Precision again. Aria allowed a brief pause. "The trust," she said, "has it been fully executed?" "Yes. The equity transfer is completed in stages as planned. And the control mechanisms, Jonathan met her gaze directly, already in effect. There it was. Not potential, not future, present. Aria did not react outwardly, but something within her settled into place. Then legally, she said the controlling interest is no longer where they believe it is. That is correct, and they have no immediate visibility into that. None that would allow them to act on it, Jonathan said. Aria nodded once, absorbing the implication. Silence followed, not uncertain but deliberate. Then she asked the question that mattered most. What triggers visibility? Jonathan's answer came without hesitation. Pressure. Aria didn't ask him to elaborate. She already understood. As long as Holloway holdings appeared stable, as long as Margaret's decisions did not create conflict significant enough to require structural review, the underlying ownership would remain undiscovered. But instability? Instability forced scrutiny, and scrutiny revealed structure. Then the system is designed to reveal itself only when it can no longer be ignored, Aria said. Yes. Jonathan paused, then added, and when it does, it will not be possible to reverse. Aria leaned back slightly, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Why didn't he tell me everything she asked? This time, Jonathan took longer to respond. Because full knowledge would have changed your behavior, he said, and your behavior needed to remain consistent. Aria considered that. It wasn't about trust. It was about integrity of the system. If I had known, she said slowly, I might have acted too early. Yes, and that would have made it visible. Yes. Another pause. Aria's next words were quieter. He built this, assuming I would wait. Jonathan's expression did not change. He built this knowing you would. The distinction was subtle, but important. Aria did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to argue. Everything she had done, every decision, every restraint, had aligned with that expectation. Not because she had been told to, but because it was who she was. Jonathan reached for a folder on his desk and slid it toward her. These are updated summaries, he said. Nothing you don't already have access to, but organized differently. Aria opened the folder. Inside were condensed representations of the same structures she had been reviewing, but mapped in a way that made their connections more visible. Ownership chains, control thresholds, points of leverage. She studied them carefully, her eyes moving across the pages with quiet focus. Margaret's authority, she said after a moment, is now operational but not structural. Jonathan inclined his head slightly. Correct. And Lucas? Has no independent authority outside what Margaret delegates. Aria closed the folder. Then they're operating within a structure they don't control. Yes. And they don't know it. No. The room fell silent again. Not empty, but complete. Because everything that needed to be confirmed had been. Aria stood, not abruptly, not decisively, just naturally. Jonathan remained seated, watching her with the same measured attention he had maintained since she arrived. What will you do? He asked. Aria paused, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she understood that the answer itself was less important than the way it would be interpreted. I'll continue, she said. Jonathan's gaze sharpened slightly. In what sense? In every sense, Aria replied. I'll observe, document, wait. For what? For the point where the structure requires acknowledgement. Jonathan studied her for a moment longer. Then he nodded. That would be consistent with the design, he said. Aria picked up the folder. I won't act prematurely, she added. I didn't expect you would. She turned toward the door, then paused. One more question, she said. Jonathan waited. If they begin to fail, she asked, at what point does it become irreversible? Jonathan's answer was quiet. They already have, he said. Aria did not react, because she understood what he meant. Failure in this context was not collapse. It was misalignment, and misalignment had already begun. They just didn't know it yet. She left the office without another word. Outside, the city felt the same as it had the day before. Unchanged, unaware. But Aria's understanding had shifted. Not dramatically, not emotionally, but structurally. She no longer needed to confirm anything. She no longer needed to question the design. Everything Owen had put in place was active, functioning, waiting. And now so was she. Not as a participant, not as an observer alone, but as the one point in the system that could not be bypassed. And for now, she would remain exactly where no one expected her to be. Out of sight, out of narrative, but entirely within control. In the weeks following Owen Holloway's death, Holloway Holdings did not collapse. It expanded. At least, that was how it appeared from the outside. Press releases became more frequent. Strategic announcements were made with deliberate confidence. Margaret Holloway positioned herself at the center of every communication, reinforcing continuity with language that emphasized strength, resilience, and forward momentum. To investors, it was reassuring. To the board, it was necessary. To those who understood structure, it was premature. Aria Bennett followed these developments not through headlines, but through filings, internal reports, and the subtle discrepancies that often accompanied rapid decision-making. She did not rely on what was said publicly, because public statements were designed to shape perception. Instead, she examined what had changed beneath those statements. The first indication of misalignment appeared in a quarterly reallocation report. On its surface, the adjustment seemed reasonable. Capital was being redirected from lower-performing divisions into higher-yield investment opportunities, primarily within emerging infrastructure projects overseas. Lucas Holloway had championed the move. It was bold, aggressive, and to most observers aligned with the company's long-term growth strategy. But Aria noticed something that others did not. The reallocation bypassed a layer of internal review that had historically been mandatory for transactions of that scale. The justification was documented, expedited decision-making in response to market timing, but the omission created a gap. Not a legal violation, but a structural inconsistency. She documented it, not as an accusation, but as a point of reference. Days later, another adjustment appeared. A series of asset transfers between two subsidiaries entities that, under normal circumstances, operated independently. The transfers were justified as part of a broader consolidation strategy designed to streamline operations and reduce redundancy. Again, reasonable. Again, incomplete. Because the timing of those transfers intersected with the earlier reallocation in a way that altered the company's internal financial balance. Individually, each decision could be explained. Together, they created exposure. Aria added it to her file. She did not intervene, because intervention required visibility, and visibility at this stage would have disrupted the very patterns she needed to observe. Meanwhile, within the executive floors of Holloway Holdings, confidence remained intact. Margaret operated with increasing authority, her presence more constant than it had been during Owen's final months. She chaired meetings, approved major initiatives, and reinforced her position through consistency rather than force. Lucas, however, operated differently. Where Margaret maintained control through restraint, Lucas sought to accelerate. He introduced proposals at a pace that exceeded the company's usual deliberation cycle. He pushed for expansion into markets that offered high returns but carried higher risk. He framed these moves as necessary evolution and adaptation to a changing economic landscape. To some members of the board, his approach was compelling. To others, it was concerning. Evelyn Carter was among the latter. As one of the longest-serving independent board members, Evelyn had built her reputation on balance. She did not oppose change, but she required clarity before supporting it. And clarity in Lucas's proposals was becoming increasingly difficult to find. During one board meeting, she raised the issue directly. These projections, she said, her tone measured, but firm, rely on assumptions that have not been fully substantiated. The timelines are compressed, and the contingency plans are minimal. Lucas leaned back in his chair, a faint smile forming. With respect, he replied, "Waiting for complete certainty is how opportunities are missed." Evelyn did not react to the remark. Certainty is not the requirement, she said. Accountability is. Margaret intervened before the exchange could escalate. We are operating in a competitive environment, she said. Calculated risk is not optional, it is necessary. The conversation moved on. But the concern remained. Aria observed all of this from a distance, not physically present in the boardroom, but present in the documentation that followed. Meeting summaries, voting records, internal memos that captured the decisions without the context in which they had been made. She reconstructed the context herself, because context, when removed, often concealed the most important details. By the end of the first month, the pattern had become clearer. Margaret maintained the appearance of stability. Lucas introduced volatility. And the system, Owen's system, remained silent. Not because it was inactive, but because it was waiting. Aria understood that silence. It was not absence. It was threshold. The point at which accumulated inconsistencies would no longer be dismissible as isolated decisions. They would require explanation. And explanation would require access. That was when the structure would reveal itself. Until then, Aria continued her work. Each morning she reviewed new data. Each afternoon she organized her findings. Each evening she cross-referenced patterns against the legal framework Owen had established. She did not rush, because speed in this context offered no advantage. What mattered was precision. One evening, as she reviewed a set of internal communications, she found something new. An email chain involving Lucas and several senior executives. The subject line referenced a potential acquisition, one that had not yet been publicly disclosed. The tone of the exchange was confident, almost assured. But the details were incomplete. Key financial projections were missing. Due diligence reports had been summarized rather than attached. And most notably, the approval pathway had been shortened. Lucas had authorized preliminary commitments before full board review. Aria read the email twice, then a third time. Not because she doubted what she saw, but because she needed to confirm its implications. This was not just aggressive. It was premature. And premature decisions, when scaled to the level of Holloway Holdings, did not simply create risk. They created consequence. She documented the exchange, added it to her file. And then, for the first time since Owen's death, she paused longer than usual. Because this was different. Not in magnitude, but in trajectory. The decisions were no longer isolated. They were accelerating. And acceleration without alignment led to one outcome: exposure. Aria closed her laptop and leaned back, her gaze settling on the window. The city moved as it always did. Lights shifting, traffic flowing, life continuing without regard for the structures that governed it. But within those structures, something had already begun to shift. Margaret believed she was reinforcing control. Lucas believed he was expanding it. The board believed they were managing it. None of them had yet recognized the pattern forming beneath their decisions. But they would, soon, because the system Owen had built was not designed to prevent mistakes. It was designed to reveal them. And when it did, it would not ask for permission. Aria did not feel urgency. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt alignment. Because everything she was seeing matched what she had been prepared for, not in detail, but in direction. She reached for her notebook, physical, not digital, and wrote a single-line threshold approaching. Then she closed it. Not because she was finished, but because she understood something that no one else in Holloway Holdings did yet. The moment of visibility was not something she needed to create. It was something that was already on its way. And when it arrived, she would not need to step forward. The structure would bring her with it. By the beginning of the second month after Owen Holloway's death, the internal rhythm of Holloway Holdings had begun to shift in ways that could no longer be attributed to transition alone. What had initially appeared as strategic assertiveness was gradually revealing itself as structural imbalance, and that imbalance, though still contained, was no longer subtle. Aria Bennett did not need access to executive meetings to understand this. The evidence was already present in the systems she had always relied on: financial trails, authorization records, and internal communications that documented decisions without interpreting them. She had spent years learning how to read those systems, not as static information, but as movement. And now the movement was accelerating. Each morning she began her review at the same time. Sitting at the same small table by the window of her apartment, her environment deliberately unchanged so that her focus remained uninterrupted. The consistency of her routine allowed her to isolate variables more clearly to recognize deviation without distraction. She no longer searched broadly. She tracked specifically. The file she had created, initially a collection of observations, had evolved into a structured record. Each entry was categorized by type: financial discrepancy, procedural deviation, unauthorized authorization, and communication inconsistency. Each was cross-referenced with the relevant entity date and executive involvement. Margaret Holloway appeared less frequently in these entries. Not because she had stepped back, but because her decisions remained within the bounds of established authority. She maintained control through continuity, ensuring that her actions could be justified within the framework that already existed. Lucas, on the other hand, appeared repeatedly, not in isolation, but in connection. His name surfaced across multiple categories: approvals that bypassed standard thresholds, directives that altered reporting timelines, and communications that suggested urgency without corresponding documentation. It was not that his decisions were entirely without basis. It was that they were incomplete. And incompleteness at this level created exposure. Aria focused on one particular sequence that had begun to take shape over several weeks. It started with a capital reallocation one she had already documented. Funds had been redirected toward a series of infrastructure investments, justified by projected returns that, while optimistic, were not impossible. The second step involved a restructuring of 2 subsidiaries that now held those investments. The third step, more recent, was an internal memo authorizing preliminary commitments to a new acquisition, one that had not yet undergone full due diligence. Individually, each step could be defended. Together, they formed a chain. And chains, when examined closely, revealed points of strain. Aria mapped the sequence carefully, aligning each decision with its corresponding documentation. She noted where approvals had been granted, where they had been assumed, and where they had been omitted entirely. One detail in particular stood out. The authorization threshold for the acquisition had been met on paper. But the underlying authority to approve that threshold had shifted, not visibly, but structurally, because the equity positions that determined ultimate control were no longer where the executives believed them to be. Aria did not annotate that conclusion in her file. She did not need to. It existed outside the system they were operating in. Instead, she focused on what could be proven within their framework, because when the time came, it would not be her interpretation that mattered. It would be their own records. By midday, she had identified 3 instances where Lucas had authorized actions that, while appearing valid, exceeded the authority he actually possessed under the restructured ownership model. The discrepancy was not obvious. It required an understanding of both the visible hierarchy and the underlying control structure. But once identified, it was undeniable. Aria documented each instance with precision, attaching supporting records and noting the sequence in which they had occurred. She did not draw conclusions. She did not assign intent, because intent in legal contexts was often contested. Structure was not. Later that afternoon, she shifted her focus to financial records, bank transfers, internal allocations, and intercompany transactions. The data was extensive but familiar. She filtered by time frame, narrowing her scope to the weeks following Owen's death. The pattern emerged quickly. Funds were moving more frequently, not in large, singular transactions, but in a series of smaller movements that collectively altered liquidity across multiple entities. This was not unusual during periods of expansion. What was unusual was the coordination. The timing of these movements aligned with the decisions Lucas had authorized. But the approvals did not always match the execution. In several cases, funds had been transferred before final authorization was documented. In others, the documentation existed, but the authority behind it was misaligned with the actual control structure. Aria paused there, reviewing the entries again, because this was the point where operational decisions intersected with legal vulnerability. She created a new section in her file, Pre-Authorization Execution. Under it, she listed each instance, attaching corresponding bank records, timestamps, and approval logs. The pattern was no longer theoretical. It was demonstrable, and it was growing. As the afternoon moved toward evening, Aria turned to internal communications. Emails, memos, brief exchanges that often revealed more than formal reports. She searched for references to urgency, to acceleration, to timelines that had been shortened without explanation. The results were consistent. Lucas's language had shifted. Where earlier communications had been measured, they were now compressed. Move forward, proceed as discussed, finalize before board review. Each phrase carried implication, not explicit, but clear. Aria did not interpret tone. She documented frequency, because frequency established pattern, and pattern established behavior. By the time she closed her laptop that evening, the file had expanded significantly. What had begun as observation had become evidence. Not of wrongdoing, not yet, but of misalignment. And misalignment, when left unaddressed, inevitably led to consequence. Aria stood and walked to the window, her reflection faint against the city beyond it. She did not feel urgency, because the system Owen had built was not reactive. It was responsive. It did not intervene at the first sign of error. It allowed error to develop until it could no longer be dismissed. That point was approaching. She could see it in the data, in the repetition, in the increasing frequency of decisions that operated just outside the boundaries of authority. Margaret had not yet intervened, either because she trusted Lucas or because she had not yet recognized the pattern. The board had not yet acted, because concern without evidence rarely translated into action. But evidence was forming, quietly, systematically, and when it reached a level that required acknowledgement, the system would no longer remain silent. Aria returned to the table and opened her notebook again. She added another line beneath the previous entry, pattern established, escalation imminent. Then she closed it. Not because she had finished, but because she understood that what came next would not require additional observation. It would require response, not from her, not yet, but from the structure itself. And when that response began, it would not be contained within internal files or quiet documentation. It would move into spaces where it could no longer be ignored. Boardrooms, audits, legal proceedings. Aria did not need to initiate that movement. She only needed to be ready when it arrived. Because when the structure finally revealed itself, it would not ask who was in control. It would show it. By the third month, the word had not yet been spoken aloud within Holloway Holdings, but it had already begun to take shape in quieter conversations, in delayed responses, and in the subtle recalibration of tone that often precedes acknowledgement. Concern. Not panic, not crisis, but the kind of concern that does not announce itself immediately because it first needs to be confirmed. Aria Bennett recognized it long before it surfaced in formal language. She saw it in the way internal reports began to include additional qualifiers, phrases such as pending clarification, subject to revision, and awaiting final verification. She saw it in the length of email threads that once would have ended in a single approval. She saw it in the increasing frequency of follow-up requests that indicated uncertainty where there had previously been confidence. The system was beginning to question itself. And once that process began, it could not be easily reversed. The first visible fracture appeared in the acquisition Lucas Holloway had initiated weeks earlier. Initially presented as a strategic expansion into international infrastructure, the deal had been positioned as both timely and necessary. Market conditions, according to the projections, favored rapid entry. Delayed action would result in lost opportunity. That had been the argument. Now the documentation supporting that argument was being re-examined. The due diligence report previously summarized was requested in full. The financial projections were recalculated using adjusted assumptions. And most significantly, the approval chain was reviewed. That review revealed gaps, not dramatic, not immediately disqualifying, but sufficient to delay finalization. The delay in itself would not have been unusual. What made it significant was the timing, because the company had already committed preliminary resources. Funds had been allocated, agreements had been implied, expectations had been set. And now the foundation supporting those actions was being questioned. Aria documented the sequence carefully. She traced the initial proposal, the accelerated approval, the early allocation of funds, and the subsequent request for verification. Each step aligned with the pattern she had been observing. Each step reinforced the same conclusion. Misalignment had moved from internal structure to external consequence. Within the executive level, the tone began to shift. Margaret Holloway maintained her composure, but her involvement became more direct. She requested additional briefings, asked for revised summaries, and began attending meetings that had previously been delegated. Her questions were precise, not accusatory, but increasingly focused. Lucas responded with confidence. He framed the delays as procedural, the concerns as temporary, and the overall strategy as sound. He adjusted projections, provided updated figures, and reassured stakeholders that the acquisition remained on track. But reassurance, when repeated too often, began to lose its effect. Evelyn Carter noticed that. During a scheduled board review, she addressed the issue directly. "We are being asked to confirm commitments that were made before full verification," she said, her tone calm but unwavering. "That is not a procedural delay. That is a structural concern." Lucas leaned forward slightly, his expression controlled. "The verification process is ongoing," he replied. "There is no indication that the underlying strategy is flawed." Evelyn held his gaze. "The strategy is not the question," she said. "The process is." Margaret intervened again, her voice measured. "We will complete the necessary reviews," she said. "Until then, we proceed with caution." The phrase was carefully chosen. Proceed with caution. It acknowledged concern without conceding error. But within the system, the effect was already in motion. Caution slowed movement. Slowed movement exposed timing. And timing, when examined closely, revealed sequence. Aria continued her work without interruption. Her file had grown into a comprehensive record, not just of individual decisions, but of their progression over time. She no longer needed to search for patterns. They presented themselves. The acquisition delay triggered a secondary review of related transactions. Those reviews uncovered additional discrepancies, minor inconsistencies, and reporting slight variations in authorization timing and repeated instances where execution preceded formal approval. Individually, none of these issues warranted escalation. Collectively, they required explanation. The internal audit team was brought in. Not publicly, not announced, but activated. Aria saw the request in the system before it was communicated more broadly. A standard audit initiation. Scope recent financial transactions and authorization processes. Time frame post-transition period. The wording was neutral. The implication was not. She did not alter her routine. She did not reach out to anyone. She did not position herself for involvement, because involvement at this stage would have introduced visibility, and visibility was not yet required. Instead, she prepared. She organized her file into sections that aligned with audit standards, financial records, authorization logs, and communication patterns. Each section was cross-referenced, indexed, and supported by original documentation. She did not add interpretation. She did not draw conclusions, because the strength of the record lay in its clarity, not its argument. Meanwhile, within Holloway Holdings, the atmosphere continued to shift. Meetings became longer. Decisions took more time. Confidence once assumed now required validation. Margaret's presence in these meetings became more pronounced. She did not raise her voice. She did not express frustration. But her questions became sharper, more direct. Why was this approved before review? Who authorized this sequence? What controls were in place at the time Lucas answered each question? But the answers, while technically sufficient, did not restore certainty. Because certainty, once disrupted, required more than explanation. It required alignment. And alignment was no longer present. Aria observed all of this through the systems she trusted. Not through conversation, not through speculation, but through documentation. Because documentation did not adjust itself to protect narrative. It recorded what had occurred, and what had occurred was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. One evening, as she reviewed the latest audit request, she noticed something new. A reference to ownership verification. Not prominent, not emphasized, but included. The audit team, in reviewing financial structures, had begun to trace control pathways. Not intentionally, not yet, but inevitably, because financial discrepancies often led to structural questions. And structural questions led to ownership. Aria paused there, not because she was surprised, but because she recognized the significance. This was the beginning of visibility. Not complete, not immediate, but irreversible. She closed her laptop and sat still for a moment, allowing the implication to settle. Owen had designed the system to reveal itself under pressure. That pressure was now present, not as collapse, but as inquiry. An inquiry once initiated could not be contained within its original scope. It expanded. It followed connections. It uncovered structure. Aria stood and walked to the window, her reflection steady against the dim light of the city. She did not feel anticipation. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt readiness, because the phase of observation was ending, not abruptly, but naturally. The system was moving toward a point where silence would no longer be sufficient, where documentation would need to be presented, where structure would need to be acknowledged. And when that moment arrived, Aria would not need to introduce herself. The system would do it for her. The request for an emergency board meeting was issued late on a Tuesday afternoon, framed in language that suggested urgency without admitting instability. It referenced ongoing audit findings, structural clarifications, and alignment of authority, all terms that within Holloway Holdings carried weight precisely because they were used sparingly. By the time the meeting convened 2 days later, the atmosphere inside the executive boardroom had shifted in a way that could no longer be described as controlled. It was not disorder, but it was no longer certainty. Margaret Holloway arrived first, as always. Her presence set the tone before a single word was spoken. She reviewed documents laid out before her with deliberate calm, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. To anyone observing, she remained exactly what she had always been, the central point of authority, the figure through which continuity was defined. But there was a difference. Subtle. In the way she paused slightly longer over certain pages. In the way her fingers rested momentarily still, as if measuring not just the content, but its implications. Lucas entered shortly after. His pace was confident, though not as measured as Margaret's. He carried a folder under his arm, his movements suggesting preparation, but also something else. An awareness that this meeting would not follow the usual structure. Other board members followed in sequence. Evelyn Carter among them, her expression thoughtful, her attention already focused on the materials distributed in advance. No one spoke unnecessarily, because everyone present understood that this meeting had been called not to confirm decisions, but to examine them. Aria Bennett was not expected to attend. Her name did not appear on the meeting list. Her role as defined within the visible structure of the company did not justify her presence. And yet, when the door opened again, she entered. Not hurried, not hesitant, but with the same quiet composure that had defined her in every room she had ever walked into. She was accompanied by Jonathan Pierce. That detail changed everything, because Jonathan did not attend meetings unless his presence was required. And when it was required, it was never without reason. Margaret looked up. For the first time since the meeting began, her composure shifted only slightly, but enough to register. Mr. Pierce, she said, her tone controlled. This meeting is restricted to board members. Jonathan inclined his head. I am aware, he replied. I am here in a legal capacity. His voice was calm, unimposing, but final. Margaret's gaze moved to Aria. There was no acknowledgement in her expression, only assessment. This is not appropriate, she said. Jonathan did not respond immediately. Instead, he placed a folder on the table, his movements precise. That will depend, he said, on how this meeting proceeds. Silence followed, not empty, but charged, because the structure of the meeting had already changed. Margaret did not object further, not because she accepted the situation, but because she understood something fundamental. Public resistance without full information created risk. And risk in this room was no longer theoretical. Proceed, she said. The audit team began their presentation. Their tone was neutral, their language precise. Their findings organized in a way that emphasized clarity over interpretation. They outlined the sequence of decisions that had been made over the past 2 months. Capital reallocations, subsidiary restructurings, preliminary acquisition commitments. Each point was supported by documentation. Each step aligned with what Aria had already recorded. The presentation did not accuse. It did not assign intent. It simply revealed gaps in authorization, inconsistencies in timing, instances where execution had preceded formal approval. Lucas listened without interruption. His expression remained controlled, though the tension in his posture suggested calculation. When the presentation concluded, he spoke. These are procedural issues, he said. They reflect the pace at which we've been operating, not a failure of oversight. Evelyn Carter responded. Procedural issues become structural concerns when they repeat, she said. And these have repeated. Lucas leaned forward. We are in a transitional period, he replied. Some deviation is expected. Margaret raised her hand slightly. The room fell silent. Deviation, she said, is acceptable when it remains within defined authority. Her gaze moved to the audit documents. These findings suggest otherwise. Lucas did not respond immediately, because the question had shifted. It was no longer about strategy. It was about authority. And authority, once questioned, required verification. Jonathan Pierce stepped forward slightly. If I may, he said. All attention shifted to him. Margaret's expression remained composed. Briefly, she said. Jonathan opened the folder he had placed on the table. Inside were documents familiar to Aria, though presented here for the first time in this context. These findings, he began, raise a question that extends beyond procedure. He paused not for effect, but for precision. They raise a question of control. The words settled into the room with weight, not dramatic, but undeniable. Lucas's expression tightened. The control structure of this company is well established, he said. Jonathan did not look at him. He looked at Margaret. Is it? He asked. Margaret held his gaze. Yes. Jonathan nodded once. Then he began. He did not present everything at once. He did not overwhelm the room with information. Instead, he introduced the structure gradually. The formation of an external holding entity, the transfer of specific equity positions, the establishment of a trust. Each point was supported by documentation. Each step aligned with legal procedure. Each connection led to the same conclusion. At first, the board members listened without fully understanding. Because the structure was not familiar. It existed outside the visible hierarchy they operated within. But as the explanation continued, the connections became clearer. Ownership was not where they believed it to be. Control had shifted, not recently, but systematically. Lucas interrupted. This is irrelevant, he said. Operational control remains within this board. Jonathan turned to him. Operational control, he said, is only valid when it aligns with legal authority. Lucas's expression hardened. And you're suggesting it doesn't? Jonathan did not answer directly. Instead, he placed a final document on the table. This, he said, is the current ownership structure. The room grew still, because now the information was no longer abstract. It was explicit. Names, percentages, control thresholds. And at the center of it, Aria Bennett. Margaret's gaze moved slowly from the document to Aria. For the first time, there was no assessment, no dismissal, only recognition, not of status, but of reality. "This is not possible," Margaret said. Her voice remained controlled, but something beneath it had shifted. Jonathan did not respond, because the document did not require interpretation. It required acknowledgement. Evelyn Carter leaned forward, her attention fixed on the page. "If this is accurate," she said slowly, "then the authority under which recent decisions were made." She did not finish the sentence. She didn't need to, because the implication was clear. Lucas spoke again, his tone sharper. "These documents need to be verified." "They already have been," Jonathan replied. "By whom?" "By the entities that process them," Jonathan said, "and by the legal framework that governs them." Silence followed. Not uncertainty, not confusion, but realization. Aria had not spoken. She had not moved. She had not needed to, because everything that mattered had already been said by the system Owen had built, by the documents he had executed, and by the structure that now stood visible and irreversible. Margaret remained still. Her composure had not broken, but it had changed, because control once assumed had now been challenged by something she could not dismiss. Not publicly, not legally, not at all. Aria met her gaze, not with defiance, not with satisfaction, but with the same quiet steadiness that had always defined her. Because this moment was not about victory. It was about truth, and truth, once revealed, did not require defense. For several seconds after Jonathan Pierce placed the final document on the table, no one spoke. It was not hesitation. It was absorption. Because what had been presented was not a claim that could be debated through opinion or interpretation. It was a structure documented, executed, and legally binding that existed independently of the assumptions under which everyone in that room had been operating. Margaret Holloway did not reach for the document immediately. She looked at it, then at Aria, then back at the document again. Her stillness was not uncertainty. It was calculation. Across the table, Evelyn Carter had already begun reviewing the details line by line, her eyes moving steadily across the page with the practiced focus of someone accustomed to identifying what mattered. Lucas, however, did not wait. He pulled the document closer, scanning it quickly, then again more slowly, as if repetition might produce a different result. "It doesn't change anything operationally," he said, his voice controlled, but sharper than before. "The company is still being run through this board." Jonathan Pierce did not respond immediately. He allowed the statement to settle. Then he spoke. "Operational continuity does not override legal ownership," he said. "It depends on it." Lucas leaned back slightly, his expression tightening. "This structure was never disclosed," he said. Jonathan inclined his head. "That is correct. Then it cannot be considered binding without review." "It has already been reviewed," Jonathan replied, "at the time of execution." Lucas's gaze shifted briefly to Margaret, not for guidance, but for alignment. Margaret did not intervene, because she understood something Lucas did not yet fully grasp. This was not a matter of argument. It was a matter of record. And records, when properly constructed, did not require approval after the fact. Evelyn spoke again, her voice calm but deliberate. "If the controlling equity has been transferred as indicated here," she said, "then any decisions made under the assumption of prior ownership require reevaluation." Lucas responded immediately. "That's an overstatement." Evelyn did not look up. "It's a procedural necessity," she corrected. Margaret finally reached for the document. Her movements remained precise, measured, consistent with everything she had ever done. But the moment she touched the paper, something changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but definitively, because contact in this case meant acknowledgement. She read. Not quickly, not scanning, but fully. Every line, every clause, every reference. The room remained silent while she did, because no one else's response mattered until hers had been formed. Aria stood where she had been since entering the room. She She did not move closer. She did not speak. She did not need to, because this was no longer about presenting information. It was about what others did with it. Margaret placed the document back on the table, with the same care she had picked it up. When she spoke, her voice was unchanged. This structure, she said, was executed without the knowledge of this board. Jonathan responded, "That is correct, and without disclosure to executive leadership, yes." Margaret's gaze remained steady. Then its intent must be clarified. Jonathan did not hesitate. The intent, he said, was to ensure continuity of control, independent of visible leadership transitions. Lucas let out a short breath. "So we're supposed to accept that control of a billion-dollar company was transferred quietly without oversight to someone who has never held an executive role." It was the first time Aria had been referenced directly in the conversation, but not by name, by position, or rather, by the perception of it. Jonathan turned slightly toward Lucas. "You are not being asked to accept it," he said. "You are being informed that it has occurred." The distinction landed. He then added with the same calm precision, "and that it is legally binding." Lucas's expression hardened. "That doesn't mean it's uncontestable." Jonathan met his gaze. "It means it is enforceable." The room absorbed that, because enforceability changed the nature of the discussion entirely. This was no longer internal. It was legal, and legal structures once activated extended beyond boardrooms. Evelyn Carter closed the document in front of her. "Then we need to consider immediate implications," she said. Her tone had shifted, not in emotion, but in focus. "This affects authority approval thresholds and the validity of recent decisions." Margaret nodded once. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "Yes," she said. Lucas looked between them. "We're not reversing decisions based on a structure we've just been introduced to," he said. Margaret turned to him. Her expression remained composed, but there was a shift in her gaze. Subtle, but unmistakable. "We are not reversing anything," she said. "We are verifying everything." Lucas held her gaze for a moment, then leaned back, because that was the first indication that even Margaret was no longer operating under assumption. She was adjusting. Aria observed all of this without interruption, because this was the moment Owen had built toward. Not confrontation, not collapse, but recognition. Recognition that control had already shifted, that decisions had already been made under incorrect assumptions, that the structure beneath the company was not what it appeared to be. Jonathan stepped back slightly, allowing the board to process. He did not need to continue, because the documents had done what they were designed to do. They had introduced certainty, not comfort, but certainty. Margaret looked at Aria again, not as she had at the funeral, not as an outsider, not as someone to be dismissed, but as a factor that could no longer be excluded. "You've been aware of this," Margaret said. It was not a question. Aria met her gaze. "Yes." Her voice was quiet, controlled, unemotional. Lucas reacted immediately. "And you said nothing?" Aria did not look at him. She continued to look at Margaret. There was nothing to say, she replied. Lucas let out a short, incredulous breath. "You let this unfold." Margaret raised her hand, silencing him, not abruptly, but effectively, because this was no longer about reaction. It was about response. She held Aria's gaze for a moment longer, then she spoke. Why now? Aria considered the question. Not because she did not have an answer, but because she understood that the answer would define what followed. "Because the structure requires acknowledgement," she said. Margaret's eyes did not shift. And before now, it did not, Aria replied. Silence settled again. But it was different now. Not uncertainty, not tension, but transition. Because the conversation had moved beyond whether the structure existed. It now centered on what would be done within it. Evelyn Carter spoke once more. "We need a formal review of all decisions made since the transition," she said. "Independent, comprehensive, and immediate." Margaret nodded. "That will be arranged." Lucas did not object, not because he agreed, but because the ground beneath the discussion had changed. An objection without foundation carried no weight. Aria remained still, because she understood something none of them had fully articulated yet. This was not the climax. This was the point of no return. The moment where the structure had become visible, where denial was no longer sustainable, where action from this point forward would be guided not by assumption, but by what had already been set in place. She did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel vindication, because this had never been about proving anything. It had been about allowing truth to arrive at the moment it could no longer be ignored. And now that it had, everything that followed would unfold within its boundaries. Not hers, not Margaret's, not Lucas's, but the structure Owen had left behind. And that structure did not need to be defended. It only needed to be applied. The meeting did not end with resolution. It ended with recognition. Not spoken, not formally recorded, but understood by everyone present, the structure had changed, and nothing that followed could proceed as if it had not. Within 24 hours, the internal mechanisms of Holloway Holdings began to adjust. Not dramatically, not visibly to the outside world, but with precision. The audit process expanded. What had initially been framed as a targeted review became comprehensive, extending across all major transactions executed since Owen Holloway's death. External auditors were engaged not as a precaution, but as a necessity. Their mandate was clear: verify authority, validate process, and identify any instance where execution had diverged from legal control. Margaret Holloway authorized it personally, not because she had relinquished control, but because she understood that control in its current state could not be maintained through resistance. It had to be redefined. Lucas Holloway did not share that understanding. He responded with urgency calls, meetings, attempts to reaffirm his position within the operational structure. He spoke to department heads, reinforced directives, and emphasized continuity in a tone that suggested more insistence than confidence. But insistence, when not supported by authority, revealed itself quickly. Executives began to hesitate, not openly, not in ways that could be challenged directly, but in small, measurable ways. Requests for written confirmation, delays in execution, questions framed as clarification rather than opposition. The system was recalibrating, and Lucas, for the first time, was no longer aligned with it. Aria Bennett did not return to the office. She did not need to. Her presence at this stage was not required to enforce the structure. The structure enforced itself. Instead, she worked from the same small apartment, reviewing the audit expansions, responding to legal inquiries through Jonathan Pierce, and maintaining the same methodical approach that had carried her to this point. Her role had changed, but her behavior had not, because behavior, unlike position, did not require announcement. It required consistency. The audit findings began to formalize within days. What Aria had documented privately was now being reconstructed, independently verified through channels that did not rely on her input. Instances of pre-authorization execution, misaligned approval thresholds, transactions that had proceeded under assumptions of authority that no longer applied. Each finding was categorized, not as wrongdoing, but as deviation. And deviation, when repeated, required correction. Margaret reviewed every report, not delegating, not deferring, because this was no longer a matter of management. It was a matter of accountability. One afternoon, she requested a direct call with Jonathan Pierce. Aria was present, though she did not speak. Margaret's voice, when it came through the line, was unchanged, measured, controlled. "We will proceed with corrective action," she said. Jonathan responded, "That would be appropriate. There will be no public acknowledgement at this stage." Margaret continued. Jonathan did not agree immediately. "That depends," he said, "on the extent to which external obligations have been affected." A pause. Then Margaret asked the question that mattered most. What is her position? It was the first time she had referred to Aria directly since the board meeting, not by name, but by relevance. Jonathan glanced briefly at Aria before responding. Her position, he said, is defined by the structure. Margaret did not press further. because she understood what that meant. Aria did not need to assert authority. Authority had already been assigned. After the call ended, Aria remained still for a moment, not reflecting, not reacting, simply allowing the shift to settle. Because what had begun as quiet observation had now moved into formal process. And formal process did not reverse. It progressed. Within the company, changes began to take shape. Lucas's role was not publicly removed, but it was reduced. Gradually, deliberately. Decisions he had previously made independently now required co-signature. Access to certain financial channels was restricted, not revoked, but redirected through additional oversight. Meetings continued, but his influence within them diminished, not through confrontation, but through structure. Margaret remained. Her position was not eliminated, but it was no longer absolute. She adapted, because adaptation for her was not optional. It was survival. She restructured leadership tiers, introduced compliance checkpoints, and aligned operational authority with the underlying ownership framework. Not because she accepted it fully, but because she could not operate outside it. Evelyn Carter played a critical role in that transition. She ensured that the board's response remained balanced, not reactionary, not defensive, but aligned with governance standards that could withstand external scrutiny. The company stabilized, not immediately, but steadily, because stability, when rebuilt correctly, did not rely on speed. It relied on alignment. Throughout all of this, Aria remained consistent. She did not attend executive meetings. She did not issue directives. She did not reposition herself within the company in any visible way, because visibility was no longer necessary. Her authority existed where it mattered, in the structure, in the documentation, in the legal framework that now governed every decision made. 1 week after the audit findings were finalized, she made her only formal request. It was delivered through Jonathan. Clear, concise, without excess. A restructuring plan. Not to consolidate power, but to distribute it correctly. Independent oversight for major transactions. Reinforced compliance pathways, separation of operational and financial authority to prevent future misalignment. It was not dramatic. It was not punitive. It was corrective. Margaret reviewed it, approved it, because she recognized something she had not acknowledged before. Control when based solely on position could be removed. Control when embedded in structure could not. Lucas did not respond publicly, but his absence from key decisions became more pronounced. Not because he had been removed, but because the system no longer required him. Aria did not take his place. She did not take any place, because her role was not to occupy space within the company. It was to ensure that the company operated within the boundaries that had already been defined. And once those boundaries were in place, they did not need to be enforced through presence, only through consistency. By the end of the quarter, Holloway Holdings had stabilized. Externally, nothing appeared significantly different. The company continued. Projects moved forward. Reports were issued. But internally, everything had shifted. Not in appearance, but in foundation. Aria stood once again by the window of her apartment, looking out over the city. The same city, the same movement. But she was no longer observing from the outside, nor was she stepping into the center. She existed somewhere in between. Not visible, not invisible, but essential, and that was enough. Because this had never been about reclaiming something that had been taken. It had been about allowing what was already hers to be recognized. By the time the next quarter closed, Holloway Holdings no longer carried the tension that had once lingered beneath its operations. The instability that had emerged in the weeks following Owen Holloway's death had not escalated into collapse, nor had it been erased through force. Instead, it had been absorbed, examined, and corrected, quietly, methodically, and without spectacle. To those outside the company, the transition appeared seamless. Reports reflected stability. Investor confidence, though briefly unsettled, had returned. Strategic initiatives continued, now paced with a level of restraint that had been absent during the period of acceleration. Internally, however, the difference was unmistakable. Decision-making pathways had been restructured. Authorization thresholds were no longer assumed, they were verified. Compliance was no longer a background function, it was integrated into every significant action. The system, once operating under the illusion of continuity, now operated with clarity. And at the center of that clarity was Aria Bennett. Not visibly, not in the way leadership was traditionally defined, but structurally. Her name appeared where it mattered, within ownership records, within legal frameworks, within the foundation that determined how and why decisions could be made. And yet she remained where she had always been most effective, outside of attention. Her final visit to Holloway Holdings took place on a quiet morning, weeks after the restructuring had been fully implemented. There was no announcement, no formal return. She entered the building the same way she always had, without interruption, without acknowledgement beyond what was necessary. The reception desk recognized her. The security system permitted her access, but the difference now was not in how she was received. It was in what no longer needed to be questioned. She moved through the building without hesitation, her steps familiar, her presence unchanged. Offices that had once felt distant now felt neutral, not welcoming, not unwelcoming. Simply part of a structure she no longer needed to navigate for position. Jonathan Pierce met her in a conference room overlooking the city. The same room where countless decisions had been made, some visible, some not. He stood as she entered. "Everything has been finalized," he said. Aria nodded. "I've reviewed the reports." Jonathan studied her for a moment. "There is one remaining matter," he added. Aria waited. "The board has prepared an offer," he said. "A formal position, executive authority if you choose to accept it." Aria did not respond immediately. She moved to the window, looking out over the skyline that had once represented something distant, something structured around access and hierarchy. Now it looked unchanged. Because the city itself had never been the variable. Only her position within it had. What would that change, she asked. Jonathan answered without hesitation. It would make your authority visible. Aria considered that, not the offer, but the implication. Visibility. It had always been the element Owen had removed from the structure, not because it lacked value, but because it introduced vulnerability. "And if I decline?" she asked. Jonathan's expression remained neutral. "Nothing changes," he said. "The structure remains as it is." Aria turned slightly, her gaze shifting from the window back to the room. "Then the answer is simple," she said. Jonathan waited. "I decline." There was no emphasis, no hesitation, just clarity. Jonathan nodded once. "I expected that," he said. Aria allowed a faint, almost imperceptible shift in her expression. "Then you understand why." "I do." Because authority in its most stable form did not require recognition. It required alignment, and alignment had already been achieved. They reviewed the final documents together, not because they needed to be changed, but because confirmation was part of completion. Ownership records, trust validations, compliance certifications, each one verified, each one aligned. When they finished, Aria closed the folder and placed it on the table. "There's nothing else," she said. Jonathan looked at her for a moment longer. "No," he agreed. "There isn't." She left the building shortly after, not escorted, not observed, just leaving. As she stepped outside, the air carried the same quiet movement it always had, people passing, traffic flowing, conversations, continuing without pause. Holloway Holdings stood behind her, unchanged in appearance, but entirely different in structure. She did not look back, because there was nothing behind her that required confirmation. Margaret Holloway remained within the company. Her role had been redefined, but not erased. She adapted as she always had, aligning herself with the structure that now governed decisions, rather than attempting to override it. Their paths crossed only once more. Briefly, in a hallway. Margaret stopped. So did Aria. There were no witnesses, no audience. Just two individuals who understood what had passed between them, not in words, but in consequence. Margaret spoke first. "You could have taken everything she said." Aria met her gaze. I didn't need to, she replied. Margaret held that gaze for a moment longer, then nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Because for the first time, she understood something she had not before. Power, when asserted, could be resisted. Power, when structured, could not. They moved past each other without another word. Lucas Holloway was no longer present in the same capacity. His role had diminished to the point where his influence no longer extended beyond minor operational areas. Not removed, but no longer relevant. The system had adjusted, and in doing so, it had defined its own boundaries. Aria returned to her apartment that evening. The same space, the same quiet, but it no longer felt temporary. Not because she intended to stay there indefinitely, but because it represented something she had chosen, not been assigned. She placed her keys on the table, sat by the window, and allowed the stillness to settle. There was no sense of victory, no satisfaction in what had unfolded. Because nothing had been taken. Nothing had been won. What existed now had always been there. It had simply been unseen. And now that it had been seen, it no longer required her presence to exist. She would not remain within Holloway Holdings, not because she could not, but because she did not need to. The structure would continue, the company would operate, the system would hold, and her role within it would remain quiet, embedded, and beyond removal. Aria closed her eyes for a moment. Not to escape, not to reflect, but to rest. Because the process had reached its natural conclusion, not with confrontation, not with triumph, but with balance. And balance, once established correctly, did not demand attention. It simply remained. The story does not end with the moment power shifts. It lingers in what follows, when nothing dramatic happens, when no one is forced to kneel. When silence carries more weight than any declaration ever could. Aria Bennett was never the loudest voice in the room. She never needed to be. Because the truth she carried did not depend on being heard, it depended on being real. And reality, once aligned with structure, has a way of outlasting everything built to control it. Margaret Holloway believed power was something you held tightly, something you defended in public and enforced in private. She was not entirely wrong. But she misunderstood one thing: more that relies on control must constantly be protected. Power that is built into the foundation protects itself. Aria did not expose anyone. She did not humiliate. She did not return what had been done to her. She allowed the system to speak. And when it did, it said everything that needed to be said. Perhaps that is the quietest form of justice. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that leaves no space for denial. If you've stayed with this story until now, you already understand that strength does not always announce itself, and dignity does not require an audience. If you were in her place, would you have spoken sooner or waited until the truth could no longer be ignored? Wherever you are watching from, and whatever time it is, there feel free to share your thoughts. And if stories like this, where silent structure and justice intersect, resonate with you, you may choose to stay for the next one.